Welcome back. So, Janet, you were asking a question
Yeah,
of Brant.
I was really trying to get to how it is that we believed that we could separate parts of our body and not think of ourselves as whole beings. And is that something that we're in the process of fixing, working, back in to think of, you said, what was it, or body, heart, mind, and spirit.
Mhm.
Right.
Yes.
And as it regards to the brain, I'm sure that's been something that no one's really looked at before, but it's very important in the way that we begin to treat diseases of the brain, right?
Yes, exactly. So, it is interesting how this all came about. It does seem like in medicine, it's been a pretty reductionistic model up till now, and a pretty purely physicalist, materialistic model as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the body is viewed as a machine, and there are these separate parts that work together. And that model has yielded great insights into how the human body functions, but it's also missed a lot. And particularly when we get to something as complex as the brain, which is the most complex thing in the known universe. Vastly, it's not like a computer. I mean, it's often compared to a computer, but a computer is like a static machine.
Mm-hmm.
As you were saying, the brain is like this flowing, living, almost like this big amoeba. It's constantly in motion. Everything we experience changes the brain. Listening and watching this now is changing your brain. Every new experience we have makes a change in the brain. All learning involves changing the brain. And so this holistic approach to the brain is still pretty new. It's gaining popularity in medicine in terms of integrative approaches to medicine, body-mind medicine, seeing how the brain and the mind and the body and the immune system all work together. There's larger and larger systems that are being linked together, but holism still has kind of a flaky name to it in some parts of medicine. And medicine and researchers, they want to be hard-headed. Nobody wants to be accused of being soft if you're a researcher or you're a physician.
No, but it's okay to come up with a magic pill that nearly poisons us to death, but does cure whatever the disease is that it's aiming for.
Exactly.
I mean, it seems very short-sighted to me that this has happened.
Yeah. But don't you think that that's just a reflection of the bigger thing that's going on in the world? And the indoctrination that we've all experienced throughout our lives is you're an individual, you're separate from everyone else, you're separate from the environment. And so I that's how in listening to your question and thinking about it, that's kind of how, I mean, isn't that really what's happening here? It's just a part of that bigger whole.
Yeah, I think that's right, that whole Newtonian model, it's like contemporary physics hasn't quite caught up with that in medicine. I mean, in physics it's caught up and replaced the old Newtonian model, but the new physics, that model hasn't quite seeped into medicine as completely.
Not yet.
Not the quantum physics part of that, yeah.
Right.
They can't ignore that much longer, though. Would that be accurate?
I think so, because one of the things that turned the spotlight onto neurogenesis, on the significance of it, was depression. So, these new class of antidepressants called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, has been like the best thing since sliced bread for modern psychiatry. So for the past 20 or 30 years, modern psychiatry has been operating under this theory that depression is actually a brain disease that involves lower serotonin levels. And what a person needs is medication, an SSRI, an antidepressant, to boost their serotonin levels. And once they have higher serotonin levels, then they feel good. Well, it turns out that that whole model is not true. The whole thing is false. And the way it was discovered was they gave depressed mice Prozac to see what the effects were on the brain.
And Prozac is an SSRI, correct?
Right, it's an SSRI, yes. And most of what we know about the brain, we know from animal studies, mostly from mammal studies, because all mammals have similar architecture. We have the same three brains: the reptilian brainstem, the mammalian limbic system that's responsible for emotions, the neocortex, which is responsible for higher thinking in human beings, but which is also present in all other mammals. All mammals share the same neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, neuropeptides. So they have done a lot of experiments with depressed mice, and they gave them Prozac. And what they discovered is that actually the Prozac worked not by increasing serotonin levels, but by increasing their rate of neurogenesis. So they did this one experiment where they actually blocked the increase in serotonin levels, but they allowed the enhanced neurogenesis to occur, and they got undepressed. They did it in the reverse, where they, serotonin levels go high, but you block the neurogenesis, and there's no change in depression. So this whole serotonin deficiency theory is wrong. And the pharmaceutical companies know this at this point. They are madly at work looking for new drugs to increase the rate of neurogenesis. And when they discover them, we will undoubtedly hear nonstop commercials for them. But in the meantime, there are a lot of other things that increase our rate of neurogenesis and don't have the side effects that the SSRIs do. Antidepressants are a $16 billion a year industry.
Wow.
Pharmaceutical companies, I think of them as really the cartels. They've got a good thing going here. They don't want to stop that. But it turns out that there are many other ways of increasing neurogenesis. And the side effects of the antidepressants involve things like loss of libido, loss of your sex drive, which is depressing in itself.
But then you take Viagra or Cialis.
Right, that's right. That's right.
Only if you're a man.
Right. And there's a new one for women, supposedly.
Sorry, Janet.
Oh, that's all right.
There's a loss of serotonin receptors in your brain, and so they can become addictive. And also, the antidepressants work with less than half the people who are depressed. One of the things that actually has been shown to work as effectively, and in some studies more effectively than SSRIs, are omega-3 fatty acids. It turns out there's a set of studies that show that for low depression or medium depression, omega-3 fatty acids, about 6 grams a day, are more effective than SSRIs, are more effective than Prozac. And the head of the National Institute of Health has said this, but it has none of the side effects. So this book is really about increasing neurogenesis. There are many ways to do it, many ways to do it naturally. Antidepressants are sometimes really helpful, but in my opinion, they are vastly overprescribed. Right now, 25% of American women between 25 and 45 are taking antidepressants.
Wow.
That's crazy.
Doesn't that seem crazy? It doesn't seem like something is wrong with this picture.
So I have a question about depression, and given your background and what you do for work, this might be a two-part question if it comes out correctly. Is there a biological cause for depression? That's the first part. And the reason I ask that is because from my experience of having dealt with my own depression and so I realized I was depressed. So I go to county health in San Diego. They make me go see this doctor who was almost comatose. It's like every time I met with him, I thought he needed antidepressants more than I did. But I got on those for like 9 months and then or 6 months or whatever it was, and then I stopped taking it because it got me back to a place where I felt like I was stable again. But my experience of my own dealing with depression and watching young teenagers with depression, it hit me one day that the reason that most people are depressed is because they're not in touch with who they are as a being, and they're not living their purpose. So can you speak to that a little bit and from your experience as a clinical psychologist?
Yeah. So modern psychiatry sees depression as a biological illness, right? And it requires medication in the form of antidepressants. Most psychologists like me see that depression is really psychological, that then causes changes in the body and in the brain. So nobody doubts that there's changes in the chemistry and changes in the body. The question is, what causes it? And it's a chicken and egg situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I personally believe that although there's a certain biological loading that some people may have for this, that the lion's share of this really comes out of acting unskillfully, acting in ways that are out of touch with who I am, acting in ways so I don't get the emotional nourishment that I need from other people, from activities that flow from my deeper being, and that the kind of isolation, the kind of deprivation, the kind of just false satisfactions that people have, it leads to depression. And so psychotherapy is as effective as SSRIs for getting out of depression, and both together are even more effective. And I would imagine that the diet and the lifestyle in this book is also a hugely effective antidepressant, and I would wager more effective than any particular one single approach like a biological approach would be.
And even like when you were talking earlier about being involved in groups and, getting that kind of stimulation is also a part of that as well, correct?
Exactly right. Again, it's body, heart, mind, spirit. It's like the brain thrives on stimulation, on optimal stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
Too much stimulation and it shuts down and neurogenesis slows down. Too little stimulation and it also shuts down and neurogenesis slows way down. It's like the brain wants to be engaged at every level, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And when we are optimally engaged with the world and bringing forth our deepest self, neurogenesis rates are really high and we feel really good.
That's awesome.
A side question to that is I cannot remember the author's name, but the book was about neuroplasticity. And in the book, he is talking about different games and so forth that people could play that would stimulate other parts of the brain to maybe take over some of the activities that a part that was damaged or broken in some way had been doing. One of the questions that I would have about that is, like, there's a site, I think it's called Lumosity, where they have all these games that you can play that are supposed to stimulate the game. But isn't that just sort of like another drug, just kind of looking at it from just one side?
That's right. It's one kind of stimulation. So
Yeah.
research on these computer games is now coming in pretty clear, which is that they work at getting you better at that particular game, but they don't generalize to the rest of the brain. That the specific skill that they increase through that particular game or crossword puzzle or whatever it is, that gets built up. But even after about 50 times, like with the crossword puzzle, it doesn't help much. Need a variety, even if we're just talking about the mind and memory and the brain and the mental function, we need a variety of mental stimulation as well. And just doing computer games it just doesn't generalize to other parts of the brain. And so the research on this is pretty sobering. So even some of these brain games that are designed, they say, by neuroscientists, they aren't very effective actually at enhancing the whole brain. They're actually very, very limited in what they can do.
It's almost like they're just one little piece of this puzzle that is what the brain actually needs to be very healthy.
That's right. That's right.
Let's take a break. And when we come back, I want to take this in another direction. Okay, we'll be right back.